Well, Glenn, when I first saw the national security strategy about 2 Fridays ago, I said, my God, let me take a look at it. And of course, I only had a couple of minutes before I went on with Judge Napolitano, but I did look at the table of contents, and here it is. Okay. And I said, my God, strategy, priorities, Western Hemisphere. Huh? Asia, Europe, Middle East. Where's Russia? Oh, it's part of Europe. Oh, okay. Africa last, as usual. Priorities, regions, Western Hemisphere. This is 180 degrees from what had been the case in the past. And when people ask me to, well, compare that since World War II, and well, I was only a little boy during World War II, but I was very much alive and engaged um, when Wolfowitz, uh, Deputy Secretary of State to Rumsfeld, after that big win against those Iraqi crack troops in 1991 in Desert Storm, okay, that's when Wolfowitz wrote his strategic doctrine, okay? People know about this, but it's very interesting to know that at that time, General Wesley Clark, who was actually had been commander of NATO forces. He came to Wolfowitz and said, "Paul, way to go, Paul! This is terrific. What's the biggest lesson you have learned from this great victory here in 1991?" And without batting an eyelash, Wolfowitz said, "Oh, the biggest lesson and the most significant one that we have to keep in mind is that we can do these things and the Russians can't stop us." Now, Wolfowitz was a bright guy, okay? His instincts were not mine, but he said, look, now, General Wesley Clark, there will come a time when we will not be in this kind of preeminent position where we can win all the time and people will challenge us. So, in the interim, our national strategic strategy or national strategic doctrine has to be that we're the hegemon. We have to make sure that if any other people come up and rival us in any way, we knock them down and keep our primacy. So that's what we'll do for the next while. Well, that was 1991. The U.S. invaded Iraq again, or this time trying and did overthrow Saddam Hussein. Did the Russians stop us? No. When was that? Oh, that was 2003. Oh, what happened in Syria, though, 2015? Well, the Russians pretty much stopped the U.S. momentarily until the head chopper came in to be the, the new prime minister. Uh, but the big deal was in 2022 when the Russians stopped us. How did they stop us? They stopped us from taking Ukraine into NATO. So the difference in strategy between 1992, when we had the Wolfowitz doctrine, and now could not be more stark. And I'm not going to show it again, but when I saw the strategy, principles, and priorities, Western Hemisphere, I said to myself, "My God, what does this mean?" And to me, it means that somebody sensible has gotten to Trump. Maybe it's Tulsi Gabbard, maybe somebody else, and said, look, uh, remember back in September when the leaders of half the world, convened in Beijing for celebrating victory over Japan, the 3rd of September. Do you remember? My God. I mean, that was most of the significant people in the world, and sort of if you feel isolated, well, that's because there's this tectonic shift from west to east in the center of power, and Russia is part of that. Okay, so not only should you knock off this notion about challenging China at sea, for God's sake, with a navy that can't do it, but you ought to realize that China and Russia are joined at the hip, and you ought to make sure that you realize that when you're looking at Ukraine and other things like that. So Russia, well, Russia tells us that their core principle is not to have Ukraine and NATO. Oh, core principle. Well, what's our core principle? Well, in the guidance or in the national strategy document, it says our core principle is to hasten resolution of the Ukraine crisis in a way that will stop a war that could get out of hand in Europe. And also, our core interest, again, using the Soviet as well as the Russian terminology, is to make sure that we have strategic stability with Russia and that we work out a modus vivendi. My God, where does that appear? Oh, under Europe, sort of as a as a castaway. That's the new doctrine. And for people to belittle that and to say, well, it doesn't matter, well, I just say, well, you don't belittle it. When the Russians come up with a new, say, a nuclear doctrine, man, you go apey on the Hershey Highway, as we used to say in the Bronx. You go crazy dissecting and see what it might mean. So we have to give these strategic documents the uh, the attention they deserve. Are they going to be adhered to? Is there stupid rhetoric? Are there contradictions? Of course there are, especially when Trump dictates it, as he probably did to his speechwriters, because it reads rather well, inconsistent, but fluid. Okay. So that's what I see here. And in this week is the crucible as I see it. What do we have? We have Witkoff and Kushner going to talk in Berlin under the sponsorship of Chancellor Merz, uh, Zelensky. Are they going to talk to the Europeans and the Prime Minister of Finland? I mean, there are all kinds of Europeans there, and they're going to say what? Well, the statement that just come out, as I understand it, reiterates all European demands about what's could happen, what resolution Ukraine could come to. But they did that once before. They did that at the very end of November when Rubio met with the Europeans, and they watered down these so-called 28 talking points, because that's all they were, talking points, not a plan, okay? They watered them down 28 to 20, and they did things that they knew, included things that they knew Russia could never buy. Well, I don't know what will happen this time, but Witkoff and Kushner have listened to Zelensky. He made some nice noises that are in themselves self-contradictory, but he says, well, maybe we don't need to be members of NATO, but we need assurances and all that kind of thing. So what's going to happen this time? Well, they got it down to 28, then 20. What happened when the Europeans persuaded Rubio to get it down to 20? Well, Witkoff and Kushner went off to Moscow 2 days later and completely ignored what the Europeans thought they had negotiated with the U.S. Bottom line, I don't know what the Europeans think they have achieved now. I don't know what Zelensky thinks he may have achieved now. But in my view, what Zelensky and Kushner are going to do, and not Rubio, mind you, not Rubio, what they're going to do is go to the Russians and say, okay, look, we talked to the Europeans. We had to do that because Rubio's folks and the real hardliners, say, well, you didn't talk to the Ukrainians? Of course. So we talked to the Ukrainians. Now let's deal. And the backdrop, of course, is twofold. Number one, Russia has won the war. Okay. It's going to be pretty easy for Russia to take those last outposts in Donetsk, okay? And the big drop up is that Putin, and people have to take these things seriously. Putin has always said that our overall priority is to prevent relations with the United States from falling into a state of complete disrepair. The way he says it is make sure that we can have a decent relationship with the United States. That's our overall priority. Ukraine, secondary. U.S. bombs the hell out of Iran. We don't like it, but secondary. Okay. Now, that's the overarching attitude on Putin's part. What about Trump? Trump makes it clear in the national security strategy that his core interest is to develop a good relationship with Russia, and getting the Ukraine thing aside, that's what he wants to do. So core interest, he even uses the Russian term. So when the Russians say, yeah, part of that national security strategy, that lines up with how we see the world, that's real. Am I being Pollyanna? I don't think so. I mean, I'll close with this, but if the president of Russia and the president of the United States see an overweening, uh, a superseding desire to create a better relationship, well, from Putin's point of view, he still can. Is Putin sure that Trump still can? No, he's not. And so you have to go through this charade, as the British say. We say charade, of listening to the Europeans, and then, if precedent is followed, ignoring their demands and working it out with Russia, and marginalizing not only the Europeans, but Zelensky himself. I think that's what's going to happen. But the last thing I'll mention here, Glenn, because it is related, on the 22nd of September this year, Putin personally made a very formal presentation saying, look, we only have one strategic arms control agreement left with the United States. It's called New START. It puts imposing limits on strategic weaponry. It expires on February 5th, 2026. We think that we need to abide by those same quantitative limits, and we're willing to do so as long as the U.S. follows suit. Now, 22nd of September, a week or two later, some journalist says that President Trump, what do you think about that offer by Putin not to exceed the limits of a New START for a whole another year? And he said, "Oh, it sounds like a good idea to me." Now, since then, the Russians have been saying publicly, as well as I'm sure through other channels, it sounds like a pretty good idea to you. Well, could we have something a little bit more official, Mr. Trump? Now, this is not a trifling matter. They don't have anything more official. Count the weeks, February 5th, okay? There's no thought of renegotiating that treaty, but it's easy as pie, as Lavrov has already said. All you have to do is say, okay, we'll observe those limits for one more year. The fact that Trump has not been able to give any answer on that, other than, so like a good idea to me, that's the litmus test, in my view. That's more important than Ukraine, more important than Iran, more important than anything else. If the Russians see that Trump cannot or will not observe this very simple token of enhancing strategic security, because that's what it's all about, they will have doubts as to whether he can deliver on any promise, and they will take all that into account. Sorry for the long soliloquy, but I've been sort of thinking through this all morning and wondering what's going to happen now that they've met in Berlin and that they'll meet again to decide whether to pick Putin's pocket.